the Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today we are joined as always by political scientist Paul Buchanan, and we're going to discuss today whether or not we are witnessing a fundamental change to global economics. And in particular, Paul and I will discuss how since the Covid-19 pandemic arrived, even neoliberal state economies have embraced an expansionist government strategy and significant degrees of stimulus. It would appear that the excesses of small government, market-driven economies have, at this time, run their course. But what will replace earlier systems? From a political economy point of view, what can we expect to take shape as the pandemic grinds on, even while we all have had a glimpse of what a post-pandemic new normal may mean? Those are the main questions and the main discussions that we're going to do. But before we deep dive into these issues, remember, if you are joining us live, we can include your comments in this program. So with all of that set and you're ready to go, we'll go across to Paul, who's waiting online right now, and kick this show, or get this show on the road, shall we say. Good afternoon, Paul.
Good afternoon, Selwyn. I hope you're well.
Very well. As you can see, we're coming from very sunny and warm Auckland City today, and you're over in the western flank of Auckland City. We're edging into summer kind of style now, aren't we, Paul? If you're wondering what the hat is on my head, I'm starting to look a bit like Billy Connolly because it's been so long since we've been able to get a haircut in this part of the world that people just don't want to see that, Paul. But anyway, Matua, how are things with you? Ka pai.
Oh, they're good. They're good. Like I say, this weather has been sterling, and I don't have the troubles you have with crazy hair. I just pat it down.
You've got a secret weapon there, maybe, but but
I need sunscreen. That's what I need.
Yeah, sunscreen. Yeah. Looking at this global economy, Paul, there's so much to this, isn't there? And we've kind of come through decades of neoliberalism, the Friedman kind of Chicago School of Economics kind of periods, the Reaganomics, the Thatcherism. In the New Zealand context, there was Rogernomics, and then the various versions of what a mercantile economy basically pitches to its peoples. And coming all through this, here comes the pandemic, here comes COVID, it approaches, it starts to hit and it beds down, and people wake up to the view of what a government is supposed to do in times of crisis. Paul, I think that's the precursors to all of this, and what we're looking at today, aren't we? And thank you for coming up with this idea, is looking at what exactly can we define this period we're in at the moment, and where is it tracking, what can we expect in the perhaps even medium term from the point of view of political economies?
This actually stems from a conversation you and I had off camera. A lot of our listeners probably don't know that you and I, we speak regularly, but we tend to do postmortems after these shows and talk about all sorts of things, Absolutely. But here's getting to the point. So this is what I, drew out of that conversation we had off camera. And then added in some reading. I read last week about the intellectual competition between Paul Samuelson, a Keynesian economist, and Milton Friedman, and how they were the dominant figures of the mid-20th century when it comes to economic thought. And so, and it was fascinating reading. I happen to think Samuelson was the better individual. But Friedman had the more lasting legacy in the latter part of the 20th century. So with that having been said, it got me to thinking about this, Selwyn. The first one is about long cycles in economics, and economic theory in particular. And when we came out of the Depression, Keynes and his theory of, if you will, demand side economics. That is, the state, not only as a macro manager, but it would help prime the pump by doing infrastructure things and what have you that would increase demand for goods and services. And he was the seminal thinker of the earliest 20th century. And the idea was that the state, it's not the free hand of the market that guides economic interaction. It's actually the visible hand of the state as macro manager via regulation, via taxation policy, those things that will level the playing field, set the rules of capitalist competition. In fact, some would argue that Keynes saved capitalism from capitalists who had driven the global economy into the Great Depression.
Could you just explain that part a little bit, if you can?
Yeah, the idea is if you leave the market to govern itself, so the Adam Smithian line that the invisible hand of economic competition will lead to what is known as market clearing, that it will reach optimality because self-interested maximizers of opportunities, as economic actors are called, will pursue their interests, individually. They don't necessarily have to coordinate the pursuit of their interests, but in the aggregate, the market's going to clear. Everybody's going to be arranged in the economic system according to their abilities, their resources, and that sort of thing. Keynes didn't believe that. He goes, no, in a world where we're born in to the economic systems with different resources, different opportunity structures, you name it. I mean, race, gender, all those things. The economic system is not neutral. It's not, it's not blind. That in fact, economics is political from the get-go. Your opportunity structures, in large measure, are determined by who you are and who you know. So Keynes thought the best thing here is A, level the playing field so that competitors can compete on equal terms, and B, because capitalists will pursue monopolization inevitably, and that will stifle competition, allowing them to do so is ultimately detrimental to the capitalist enterprise as a whole. So the idea was Keynes saved capitalism from capitalists. And it gave rise, of course, to the welfare state. Because one of the things Keynes pointed out is there are things in life that capitalists will not want to do because it's not profitable. And foremost among them is the provision of goods and services. Building highways, those sort of things, those have to be funded out of taxation, and it's the public sector that has to do them. So the Keynesian logic dominated for 35 to 40 years. That's why I'm thinking of long cycles. But along came Milton Friedman, obviously a Nobel laureate, a guy who was a seminal figure in the economics department at my alma mater, the University of Chicago. We tended over in political science to look at them as the great evil, and they tended to look at us as a bunch of Marxists who were irrelevant. But nevertheless, Friedman came in, and his theory was that no, you need less government, you need less state intervention because it does not allow actors the full exercise of their economic powers. And what he basically said is less regulation, smaller government, and you allow the leading sectors of capital to determine the most profitable areas of investment. And for him, that was finance capital, hence the term monetarist theory. But that finance capitalists will seek out those areas where profits can be maximized, and then the effect throughout the economy would be trickle down. Now, Friedman strayed out of his lane because he left economics and started talking about politics. And not only did he want less government, less regulation, lower taxation, to free up the capitalist spirit, if you will, but he was very hostile to social welfare programs, to public education programs, public health. He thought those were all rent-seeking activities. So basically wasting taxpayer money that otherwise could be held in private pockets and put to useful gain in the capitalist economies around the world. His vision held sway from the 1970s until this last decade. It's called neoliberalism. There's variations of it. It was codified in something called the Washington Consensus of 1992-93, in which there was a general consensus in the World Bank and the IMF that, in fact, monetarist theory was the best way to prosperity. The trouble, though, for people like me who do comparative political economy, and I've written a lot about labor economics and labor unions, is that even though Friedman professed to the belief that free markets lead to freedom in governance, his project, his theory was put to the test in authoritarian Chile, authoritarian South Korea, authoritarian Argentina. They were the laboratory rats, and it required the repression of the working class, the brutal repression of the collective rights of non-elites for his experiment to work. And then let's remember, his experiment was trialed in the United States under the guise of Reaganomics. And although Republicans may look back nostalgically at the 1980s as the golden era of Republican thought, quite frankly, having lived in the United States on and off during the 1980s, it was not a golden era economically for the vast majority of people there, as they were seeing their welfare benefits and other such things stripped under Reagan's economic programs. Now it seems we're on the cusp of another shift. And that's why I say they're long cycles. They seem to last 30 to 50 years, in which one trend of thought, one school of thought, is dominant. So Keynesianism, 1930s to 1970s, Friedmanite theory or monetarist theory from 1970s until the 20-teens. And now we seem to be on the cusp of something else. And I would simply say this, by way of turning it back to you, is it makes me think, Selwyn, about the impact of exogenous versus endogenous factors. Now,
well, thanks for pitching that one back to me, Paul. Please explain on those two.
Yeah. That's highfalutin language or academic language. Exogenous factors are external factors that impact on economic decision making and force changes. Everything was going swimmingly, and then, like a meteor, you have this external shock, which might be the pandemic. I mean, we can come back to that. And things have to change. Endogenous factors are change from within. And if you think about economic modeling and economic forecasting, they're all designed to give people, businesses, governments, some measure of control over their economic futures, their economic destinies. So policy is crafted endogenously with the idea that what are we going to look like 5 or 10 years down the road? Now, obviously, capitalist logics are run by the quarter, right? Their futures, her time horizons are very, very short
3
term.
month cycles.
3 month cycles. But economic policymakers do, in fact, think beyond, the stock market and, these short cycle logics. And so the idea was eventually you could build robust capitalist economies that would be so resilient that, if not immune to external shocks, the endogenous planning involved would allow them to mitigate those shocks if and when they occurred. And we've now seen that neoliberalism, which was already on the wane in the places that it was trialed. Remember the pink tide in Latin America in the late 1990s and early 2000s, where we had the political shift to Hugo Chavez. We had a shift to the socialists in Chile, of all places. That was where neoliberalism was trialed the hardest. And it's the first region that turned away from it in pursuit of something else. Now, I'm not saying that the Bolivarian Revolution turned out to be all bread and roses, but the fact is there was already inklings that the neoliberal moment had run its course. And then we had two exogenous shocks. The first one was the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, which shows that, in fact, finance capitalists are not necessarily the most visionary when it comes to leading the global economy, or at least thinking about the global economy. And then the pandemic, basically almost 10 years apart, but overlapped significantly. And what the pandemic has done is shown all of the inherent flaws of the market-driven models. And I say models because there's variations throughout the capitalist world of this neoliberal experiment. But what we've now seen with the pandemic is that, be it in supply chains like we talked about last week, or be it in the provision of COVID relief across demographic, the population's demographic variations and class variations, we've seen that it has come up very wanting. And that's given rise to the idea that we have to bring, to coin a phrase, the state back in. That the state withdrew too much from that macro manager role under neoliberalism, and now it is clear that certainly when it comes to public health policy, you can't leave it to capitalists to run the response. The state must step in, and let's just look around the world. Where the state was reluctant to step in, let's say the United States, it's gone terribly bad. Brazil, where the state has stepped in forcefully, and mind you, in a non-authoritarian way, such as here, things have gone very well. Yes, right now we're dealing with a fourth wave thing, but compared to everybody else. So the broader thought for me is we've reached the end of another long cycle. We've had these exogenous shocks now hit us, wham, bam, in the space of a decade. So we're now looking at, albeit an uncertain future, a future where I think the state is going to reassume its role as a guiding hand on not only national economies, but very possibly the global economy. There'll be some more coordination between states in terms of the distribution of goods and services and that sort of thing. And we may have seen just the first inkling of it with the joint U.S.-China declaration on climate change, where President Xi Jinping and President Biden have said that climate change, in their joint statement, is an existential threat to the globe. I think, I don't want to get too idealistic and wishful in my thinking, but this is a really good sign that these two leaders recognize their mutual interests in coming together at the state level in order to fight what is probably the greatest threat to humanity that we've seen ever.
Yeah, you can't argue with that. Let's pull this back into some areas. I'll just touch on New Zealand's experience and such things, and you can see the course of recent histories about this. And with respect to COVID, at the front end, I'll just say that New Zealand's story relating to the COVID pandemic isn't finished yet. The book has not been written and the last page has not been turned. So just putting that there. But looking back, with respect to, say, 1984, the new Labour government led by David Lange came in. You had a new forward-thinking finance minister, Roger Douglas, who had obviously acquainted himself very deeply with the Milton Friedman School of Economics plans, Reaganomics. You saw Thatcherism was in its advance at that stage too. So what did we see here? You saw the conditions from the old National Party leader, Sir Robert Muldoon, we had been holding back the tide somewhat on that new wave of economics that had been sweeping the globe, like you've detailed there and defined the neoliberalism doctrine that was about to actually become dominant in countries like New Zealand too. But it had been held back in a sense by the previous Prime Minister. The new government comes in, that David Lange-led era, with the Finance Minister Roger Douglas, and you saw deregulation hit in a big way. It was named in New Zealand's context Rogernomics, wasn't it, Paul? And you saw, once again, regulation out of the way, tariffs stripped right out of New Zealand. Being a trading nation, it was a gutsy move, obviously, stripping tariffs out incrementally, but by the end of that decade, they're pretty much all gone. So it was difficult to negotiate bilateral trade agreements on the basis of tariff reductions on the other part when they're already getting tariff-free access to New Zealand's interests and such things. So it comes down to a value-added type of commodity pitch, that balance between commodity and value-added. So, all of those kind of things you saw in the New Zealand populace, an imbalance starting to occur where clearly those that had opportunity to assert privilege economically or position on services or product doing very, very well, and you saw the others that served those interests doing very, very badly. And once again, incrementally, it just got worse and worse and worse in New Zealand, to the point where in these times now that owning a house, which was always the Kiwi way for a Kiwi family, is beyond the reach of so many people. And you can see the consequences of 35 years of this particular doctrine and what it has done to a country of which has got plenty and is considered by most in the world as a very rich and privileged country. That's not the experience of many. We know that, don't we, Paul? And from that point of view, what we saw, I think, in 2017 was a new government being elected. It pitched itself as going to be transitional. It wasn't transitional to satisfy the wants of many that had a fix on what they believed that transitional meant. But what we did see with the Jacinda Ardern-led government and the Finance Minister Grant Robertson, a very close colleague and friend, tag teaming the economy in slow incremental steps toward larger government, centralising power back into government, and incrementalisation relating to stimulus in policies, house building programs, nowhere near catching up with where the deficit was, nor the ongoing requirements of the population and such things, but incrementalism nonetheless. And I kind of think that the idea, the politics, the political economy was heading in a direction for New Zealand where the population was supporting the role of larger government. I'm not saying large government, but larger governments than what the previous generation had seen in the excesses of the neoliberal experiment. So I think that is the tapestry that we saw, all the circumstances, the economic environment, the political economic environment of the New Zealand experience going into the COVID pandemic. And in some ways, perhaps, that is why the government could, not being authoritarian, but require and respect a response from its population that was largely, until recent months, stuck to by the population and got New Zealand in a big position. So that's pretty much, I think, some of the things and applying them in a New Zealand context for the New Zealand audience that we have. An interesting thing, Paul, came up. If we are looking at Keynesian economics, for example, I suppose in that kind of environment, we've seen a view where, as an alternative, you look to Keynesian economics and you think, okay, stimulus in those big areas, like from the point of view of infrastructure development, et cetera, perhaps peeling back a reliance on the PPPs or the public-private partnership type models where infrastructure, like in Sydney and other states in Australia, have advanced significantly to meet its societal and population demands. But, easing back, and perhaps that's where we kind of were thinking Keynesianism and where its merits were. But what we've seen in the COVID pandemic period and up to this point here is something quite different. And it's something that an economic historian that was interviewed on Radio New Zealand this week, and his name's Adam Tooze, and he's from the UK and has recently written a book on all of this relating to the economies and the COVID pandemic. He was interviewed by Jesse Mulligan. I'll just refer to my notes here, Paul. Adam Tooze, he identified a number of issues where governments all around the world are failing to future protect from an expected and dangerous future variant in 2022. And he's suggesting there, in that interview, is suggesting that governments big governments, but all governments around the world need to get the pharma sector ready and to prepare for such variance. Now, that private sector, the big pharma sector, has the ability and has the technology ready to go, but it's not cost effective. And he was arguing that they've got to put the money, in past times under previous orthodoxies might say, well, there isn't the money to do such things and afford things. He's saying when you embrace Keynesian economics, you have the ability to put it there because the need exists, that the price of it, if it's too high, well, you simply stimulate a response for the public good through this particular model, and then you tax those pharmaceutical sectors if the price is too high, and you distribute that wealth back within the government circle. So he saw the remedy as very simple. But it was an interesting interview, and I just wanted to bring that in because what we're seeing there is an idea coming from a global economic historian who was saying, well, by suggestion, I think he's saying, well, don't necessarily just rely on the Keynesian economics of perhaps post-war Britain, et cetera, that this is a new age. That's what I would, the takeout points, and it'd be good if some of in the audience kind of challenged me on that, but that's my takeoff points there. I, just in closing my part here, Paul, and putting it back to you, on the back of that interview that I was given the link to by an economic historian here in New Zealand, in Auckland actually, who writes a lot on Evening Report, and his name is Keith Rankin. And I quizzed Keith about this. He said, and Keith replied, Keynes pointed out that the affordability of something at the macro level lies in the availability of the resources required, and it has nothing to do with how much money a government believes that it has. And Keith went on here. He says, this is the essence of the difference between economic capitalism, Keynes, and liberal mercantilism, which is Ardern, Collins, Seymour, Shaw. Now, what he's saying there is a cross-party accord, even though we've seen incrementalism under the Jacinda Ardern government, that it still fits within that liberal mercantilism definitions. Without getting too heavy on these kind of things, we can see that those names of those leaders I just mentioned there is a cross-party accord of those parties that are represented in the New Zealand legislature at the moment. So all of that aside, Paul, we can see that there is a shaping to requirement here, perhaps in the economic modelling and the economic thinking that is being applied by governments. And if we bring in even some of the most extreme proponents of liberal capitalism, and we look at that, Singapore, for example, is, perhaps you've got intimate knowledge there. How can we compare where things may be trending and tracking in this particular thing and what to expect, say, in 2 years' time from now?
I think we have to look at it this way. In fact, you and I, some time back, we talked about ideologies and the ideational bases of certain perspectives. And I think we have to keep in mind that economic theories are intellectual constructs. Yep. They're just a way of looking at the world and specifying the relationship between the real and the ideal, where we want to go as humanity versus where we are. And I say that because anything that we see in the near to medium future will be neo in nature, that is neo-Keynesian, or maybe neo-mercantilist. And there, a place like New Zealand has very, very specific requirements because we are a very small, open trading nation. We cannot produce ourselves all the goods and services that we consume. So we have to trade, and we've moved from comparative advantage to competitive advantage. And you and I think, would agree that we need to move away from dependence on our primary sector and more into value-added production that gives us a competitive edge, perhaps related to the primary sector. My understanding is that our dairy industry is state-of-the-art, that we're world leaders in everything from milking sheds to the hybrid grasses, you name it. That's
do you think it is efficient on a global scale in that way because of the neoliberal experiment?
Well, I think that, we will continue to see, both here and abroad, that the economic interests that have benefited themselves, but also the societies in which they're located, without, really deleterious effect. Again, the finance sector has a lot to answer, but it could be that they will remain, after all, they're the status quo, but that they will have to agree to a little more state, they would call it interference, I would call it management of their affairs for the common good. And again, the pandemic has been a real eye opener. Now, the thing that makes me think that we really are on the cusp of a more state-centric or state capitalist model, because mind you, no one's going to socialism at all. I mean, that's I'm sorry to say for my lefty friends, but capitalism is still here. Maybe it's not here to stay, but it's here for the foreseeable future. The question is, how can you get it to restore the efficiencies inherent in capitalist logics of production?
To tame that beast or something like that is where you're coming from.
Yeah.
Right.
Again, we're getting back to the original proposition that Keynes had to wrestle with coming out of the Depression. Now we're coming out of a global recession, some places doing better than others, forced by this pandemic. But what I find interesting, Selwyn, and it flashed on me when you mentioned Muldoon, is the right, that is the nationalist populist right, is rejecting neoliberalism and returning to a state capitalist vision. Now, I'm wary of that because the Nazis were state capitalist. Fascism was premised on the state being the lead capitalist because they were...
You witnessed firsthand in Chile and Argentina exactly this thing, didn't you?
Yeah, and I lived under populists, in Latin America, and then of course under the bureaucratic authoritarians. But what I'm seeing is that, let's say the so-called libertarian right, the original Friedman model is rejected by the right sectors of the political spectrum in favor of more state control and management over the economic affairs of capitalism. Think of all the argument about elites.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Is that because they have moved into a government sector of which they're dominating and asserting authoritarian control, so therefore they become the elite and the ones that are going to prosper from that shift?
Yeah, I think that a lot of, let's take your average Joe who believes in capitalism. He works hard his 40 hours. He's not unionized because he bought the pill that says that unions are commies and, are not good for the economy. They restrict your choice. Or let's say that, this person bought it and was nominally a middle-class, blue-collar worker benefiting from the system. Well, those days are increasingly gone. And income disparities, both here in New Zealand and around the world, are increasing because between the elites, the 1%ers or 10%ers, and everybody else. And so the little Joes, those blue-collar guys who were middle class, are increasingly finding themselves struggling to keep up. And so they're not rejecting capitalism. They're not embracing socialism. What they're embracing is a capitalism that serves the public interest as much as it does the shareholders of the firms in which these shareholders are invested.
Yeah. Okay. So just before we dig into that, so if that is the as you defined it there, the wants of authoritarian economies or political systems, what is to become of the social democratic or the economic liberal countries where the market has led, the market has been a partnership that has been facilitated and stimulated perhaps in some ways between policy coming out of government or the legislature and the market-driven capitalists on the other side of a domestic economy or indeed a regional or global economy. So where do you see change in that respect Do you feel that what we're seeing with interventionism, stimulus, and I'm just marking, the big debates in the United States under the Joe Biden presidency is whether or not he gets his infrastructure plans over the line, et cetera, and the cost of those. So we're talking stimulus on a massive scale there. But where do you see this tracking? Is it sustainable? Is it one where interventionism coming by way of the state, for example, is going to drive up inflationary pressures to the point where the economies start to get out of kilter and the global economy becomes extreme problematic, and domestic economies unable to sustain their wants and needs of both trading sectors and their population's social requirements? That question is there once again, just to pull it back, is where do you see those kind of economies actually tracking in the next 2 years?
Well, let's remember that authoritarians have the advantage that they can impose their preferred economic vision without the normal interplay of democratic politics. So if China decides to change course, if Belarus decides to change course, they can do so.
Trading human beings, yeah.
So although, dictators still need to think not only about their own legacies, but about their increasingly restive populations. I mean, there's some measure of public good that even the worst dictator needs to do in order to stay in power, for no other reason than to keep his rivals at bay, because they certainly will say, hey, I'm the guy you should have. But here's the thing. And again, it gets back to an ideational issue in my mind, is that if you talk to neoliberal scholars, people who believe in Adam Smithian logics of, the free market, they'll tell you that there's an inherent conflict between the market and the state, because the state is an impediment to market clearing because it imposes and intervenes on what otherwise should be unfettered market preferences. I disagree. I think that in capitalism, there is an inherent tension, not conflict, tension between the areas of the state, between the state and the market, on the division of labor between them. Okay, so it's not irresolvable. And that, I think, Selwyn, is the big question of our times. We need to speak, that is, capitalists need to speak to the policymakers in government, everybody understanding that there are some serious flaws in the neoliberal model that have now been exposed on a global as well as a national basis for all to see. We have to recognize that reality. I mean, if people, want to be smoking the opium pipe and say nothing's wrong, and just because we benefited before, we need to go back that way, well, they're hitting the pipe. We have to realize things have changed and put heads together and say, okay, where can the state intervene the most efficiently? And I'll give you an example. Bridge building. No private capitalist is going to build a bridge. Why? Because he'll put all the money into it, and then a bunch of his competitors will be running trucks over that bridge and, beating them at a retail level. So capitalists look at infrastructure projects and go, nah, I'll free ride off of some fool if he goes and does it, but I'm not putting my money up when everybody gets to use it.
Meanwhile, trying to minimise taxation liability. There was an interesting thing that Warren Buffett, perhaps one of the most enduring wealthy people in the United States, and Bloomberg used to have a thing on a loop basically, and Warren Buffett's voice would come across and he'd say, "Of all the diseases in the world, I'll take taxes." So, he obviously had seen the benefits of a taxation regime where it facilitates business and the ability for even the most wealthy like him to actually prosper from it.
I mean,
it's an interesting thing and an interesting for that argument that you're putting here, isn't it? That there's that tension there. And even some of the most successful, if you look at it from the extreme capitalist point of view, have seen a mutual codependency in such ways, not just an exploitative one.
Yeah, let me give you another example. And again, I think you're hitting it now. There has to be a conversation about regulation, taxation, what promotes efficiencies in the economy. That is, what level of state intervention what type of state intervention allows capitalists to still play fair by the rules and make money at the same time. Now, I'll give you an example. It's always struck me, especially under the neoliberal phase, of the arguments against feeding kids school lunches. Especially what we call here low decile, but lower socioeconomic income children. These what also are known as the working poor. And I've always thought here in New Zealand, the right-wing reaction to that is very strong. They do not want taxpayer money put on feeding kids in school, something that happens even in a place like the United States, by the way. Now, I've thought to myself, why would they think this? I mean, sure, some of them are mean, but they're just not thinking this through. Because if you feed a kid from the working class family, and he stays awake in order to consume the lessons. I mean, I'm doing homeschooling with my 8-year-old, and he needs his breakfast before we can get to the math, because otherwise he's just not happening. The big buzz phrase in this household in the morning is focus. Folks, eat your breakfast. Well, a kid who is hungry is not focusing in primary school, which means he's not going to get an education, which means he's not going to add value to the labor market. A well-fed kid who is able to concentrate on his studies may turn out to be an astrophysicist, even if he comes from a lower, income family.
Yeah.
So
and it's mathematics in a sense, isn't it? If you provide the ability for individuals to reach their potential and you scale that out to the whole populations, the chances are you're going to have some brilliant people coming through.
Well, you're just priming the pump. Again, we're getting back, to the. But the thing also is that here in New Zealand, the same people who don't want to fund through taxes school lunch programs are also bemoaning the fact that immigration policy has led to this country losing its traditional character. By that, those are buzzwords for non-white male dominant.
Meaning, on that, the people that put that criticism there, they've been the ones that have supported a government that will refuse to provide such provisions for children, and also wants the immigration thing to ramp up to the point where the society can hardly tolerate that.
Well, see, that's just, they're not thinking. They're cutting off their noses to spite their face, because if you feed native New Zealand-born children and allow them to achieve their potential in the labor market, then you will need less immigrants to do the very same thing. So I'm like,
I think it's crazy, Paul. Sorry to interject there, but I think it comes down to those arguments, and I've observed those arguments very closely in the people and the doctrines, the sectors of where it comes from. It seems to me they're still resting within this cloak of a belief in personal responsibility, and user pays those two ideas in tandem. And so therefore everybody else that is outside of their areas of privilege, well, that's their business. That seems to be where they're coming from in many respects, as far as I can see.
Yeah, but it's interesting. It reminds me.
Which I was going to just add, that COVID is the leveler in this issue, isn't it?
It is the leveler. I mean, one thing that we've observed, I've always had a chuckle at that axiom that a rising tide raises all boats.
The Chinese one, yeah.
And well, it's a capitalist saying, right?
Yeah.
The trouble is,
Deng Xiaoping, I think, was, yeah.
Well, think about it this way, especially with climate change and rising sea levels. That rising tide doesn't raise all boats equally. If you're in a dinghy tied to the wharf, the big luxury lot can cast aside the ropes and sail away, but your dinghy is going to get swamped.
Yeah,
you have no place to go by the rising tide. So actually the rising tide will benefit you perhaps to a point, and then you will drown. You will have that. So it also reminds me, not to be too crude about it, but I was teaching political economy. It's this sort of thing years ago at the University of Arizona, and I was talking about trickle-down theory. It was the late 80s, and student up in the rafters of this class waves his hand. It's like, Professor, Professor. And I said, yes. He said, are you sure you got it right with that trickle down theory? And I said, yeah, I'm pretty sure. And he goes, no, no. It's known as the pee on us theory. The rich get richer and then they urinate on the rest of us. I have never forgotten that exchange because that kid was spot on. That kid was absolutely on top of it. He was ahead of me. And he's like, no, these guys load up on all the beer they can, and we're just downstream of them. So I'm saying this in a jocular way, but what I think we can do in the wake of the pandemic, and the fact, again, it's obvious that the system as given failed, from the supply chain, but also how the epidemic spread, the areas of vulnerability that it sought out and is still seeking out. I agree with you 100%. The book on COVID in New Zealand is far from complete. But this is a time now for better strategic coordination between capitalists and government policymakers about to re-equilibrate the relationship between state and market. Again, that tension does not necessarily have to be conflictual. It can be tense, but think of it as the tension of a tightrope, where if you get it right and you balance, the rights of the state to intervene with the rights of capitalists to pursue profit, it is very possible that we can come out of this for the better. But right now, I think the government was prescient in that it said that it was going to prepare transitional budgets. We know that the well-being budgets that have been, which the government says here in New Zealand, are the guiding policy bases for everything it does. It's been a very mixed bag, to be clear, about the well-being budgets, but it signals an intent to bring the state back in the places where the market simply cannot cope. Yeah. And I think in that measure, as an intellectual venture with practical applications, that's definitely a step in a good direction, and it was taken before the pandemic. So now there's more urgency to increasing the tempo of the well-being steps, if you will, in order to mitigate, the very deleterious economic as well as social consequences of this disease.
Yeah, so that what we're saying there basically is the direction is right, that the direction is honourable. It is the rate of incrementalism that is in question here. And within those debates, that perhaps is what I'm hearing all over the place from since 2017, really. Let's just have a look. I've got a comment that has come in here. Now it says from Facebook, a Facebook user. Now what's happening there is those that are putting questions coming through in the Facebook groups, Facebook has changed some of its settings, so it's blocking out your name. So I apologise for not referring to your name. But anyway, the message here that has come through is Ray Dalio from Bridgewater Capital in a recent interview said that the days of higher interest rates and high increasing inflation are going to be short-lived. The reason being is that, whoops, we lost that. I'll just bring it back on screen. The reason being is that the United States, the world reserve currency, will not be able to sustain this current phase due to the US government's debt pile and its need for month-to-month resuscitation debt relief. And it goes on here, the comment goes on with respect to QE or quantitative easing, money printing, a loan, etc., into some of the deeper areas of that, and does poses a position where what impacts does the political economy have on the large global powers, and in this case what he's talking about there was the Russian Federation and the United States of America. Now Paul, with that, as we edge toward closing this program, what it's raised there is this concerns amongst economists relating to inflationary pressures, and there's a lot of comparison that's going on to the politics of the policies of politics over in Japan, for example, and saying, well, Japan's endured stagflation to a degree, and issues like this, when other countries have shied away from perhaps some of the precursors that would lead a nation's economy into those realms. But generally, from the point of view of inflationary pressures, once again, you're a scholar and have lived and born and bred in some ways, isn't it, down in the Latin American parts, particularly Argentina and Chile. You saw firsthand the excesses of inflationary pressures and inflation at record levels, what it did to the economies, to the populations, and what political opportunism came from that environment. Can you speak to some of the dangers there and whether or not you believe that we're heading into a situation where inflationary pressures are going to be the problem of the next 10 years, or whether or not it is short-lived and only a response to the stimulus packages that perhaps Keynesian economic doctrine would observe and perhaps even cause in some people's minds?
Well, I look at inflationary pressures can be caused by a number of things, not just prolific spending. For example, right now, with the supply chain bottlenecks, the very price of consumer commodities is going up because there's less of them to consume. And so there's upward pressure on the pricing of a whole range of goods until such a time as supply equals demand. And that's not happening at the moment. So the inflationary pressures in a place like here, I mean, we were talking the other day about, vegetables and what have nothing to do with government spending. They have to do with, the increasing scarcity of certain basic goods until these bottlenecks are resolved. Now, in Latin America, it was prolific spending for political purposes that often led to these crazy inflationary spirals. I've lived under 1,000% inflation a week in both Argentina and Brazil. It's insane. It's what you try to do is you try to get into tangible goods. So you buy furniture, cars, you buy anything tangible because your money is melting in your hand, is depreciating from morning to afternoon. Again, it's crazy land. And what people do is they take their money and they put it into tangible objects. The rich go into gold, go into those sort of things and move their money offshore. The poor just start buying up, anything, jewelry, just to hold it. We're not in that situation. And I don't think that something like the infrastructure bill, although it adds to the U.S. debt, is not going to be the sort of inflationary trigger, because it's going to result in jobs. It's going to, actually kickstart significant sections of the economy, and that in turn will allow, without printing more money, will allow money to circulate more freely throughout the economy than it is currently. So, because that's, part of the deal is you start printing money to make up for the fact that it's losing its value. I don't see the dollar really doing that. And we have to remember that even though the United States in particular is a huge economy, it doesn't exist in isolation. The Chinese now have some issues of their own, and it's not just the pandemic or the supply chain. They have a real estate crisis with the Evergrande bankruptcy imminent. They have something like 1 million people waiting on homes that aren't being built. That's a social problem. That's more than an economic problem.
And this is, in a different way, it's the kind of thing that happened that led into the global financial crisis, but that was one of leverage, wasn't it, into homes. So it comes back to a home problem with respect to. But
I will say this: the listener who wrote that comment at the end, he talked about the U.S. waging wars, and I will say this: although it has less to do with not being able to pay for those wars. Let's be very clear: if the United States believes that it has to go pick another fight with somebody, it doesn't matter how much deficit spending they accrue, they're going to do it. The decisions to fight, to go to war, are political decisions, and of course the military-industrial complex benefits from war, so they'll be pushing it. However, we are now living in a political moment in which people are tired of the U.S. engagement in the so-called endless wars. And there is increased skepticism about the relationship between weapons manufacturers and the political elite. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon have all come under more scrutiny because, quite frankly, they're warmongers in the U.S. public, including the right side of the spectrum, that sort of neo-isolationist side, are a little more skeptical. So it's not an opportune moment to be a warmonger in the United States. And so I don't think this will have an impact on the U.S. propensity to wage war. I think we're going to see a pause, and that pause has been signaled by the passage of this infrastructure bill and by the fact that the U.S. right, at least in terms of its media appearance, has stopped with the foreign enemies drumbeat and have now got into internal culture wars as the place to go because they don't have economic solutions. You see, they were the party of the neoliberal theorists. And look at what it's led the United States to. So I think if you look at, not beyond the economics of the matter, if the United States is able to get this infrastructure package going, even without the social spending, remember they had to split the package into infrastructure building and then social spending. I don't know if that's so. Yeah, they tried to tie it together at first. That wasn't going to work. So they've got this trillion something infrastructure package going. It's got to get up and running. And for two reasons. The more long-term reason is to return the United States to a level of comparative as well as competitive advantage in mostly value-added production, but they need the infrastructure. And then there's a political imperative. We have midterm elections a year from now. In fact, I think you and I next week are going to talk about, the U.S. 1 year after.
Indeed. Absolutely,
okay, so
we are.
Okay, so we'll hold off until then. But, think of the political calculation. This infrastructure bill for the Democrats it's the end all. They got to get that thing up and running or they're going to lose.
And Trump campaigned on infrastructure and was never able to deliver. So I get what you're talking about in ordinary political terms. There's a lot riding on it. There was a lot of expectation on Biden. There was a lot of doubt on Biden whether or not his people could get it through the House. And it'll be an interesting program next week, won't it, Paul?
Yeah, I'll reserve my comments until next week because I've got a couple of... Anyway, I have some opinions I'd like to share with our listeners. But yeah, the bottom line is for political as well as economic reasons, this infrastructure bill has to be turned into law and then into practice. We need, boots on the ground and shovels in the dirt. And the sooner that happens, the better it'll be for the Democrats' chances of holding on to their control of Congress, which is on a knife edge, by the way. If they don't, and this thing gets bogged down in bureaucratic red tape or infighting, then they most certainly will lose the midterm. And at that point, what you'll probably see, rather than a return to neoliberal economics, is one of these national populist variants. So it's still going to be state-centric. It's just going to have a more authoritarian and, if you will, virulently nationalist tone to it. Rather than be efficient and competitive per se.
And in the meantime, tax cuts are off the agenda, and government-led stimulus is the flavour of the day. That's what we've been looking at this week, and we look forward to your return next week. It'll be around about the same time. That's midday New Zealand time on a Thursday, which is around 6 p.m. Eastern time in the United States. And we'll be, once again, like Paul has talked about, we'll be looking at 1 year since the US presidential elections. What has been achieved, what hasn't, and where are things tracking with respect to the United States political apparatus. And once again, looking across on the horizon there as the midterm elections looming, in a sense. Until next week, thank you for your company. Thank you, Paul, for your company too, and we'll gladly be back for that episode. Until then, take care.